At the start of this year, it would have seemed quite incredible that an empty desert, a vast silence, should within 12 months be occupied by a huge international army, rehearsing for a war of liberation in the name of the United Nations. That 1990 would turn out to be quite such a year of reckoning was neither discerned nor discernible.
A year of reckoning was perhaps foreseeable elsewhere, in the Soviet Union, in Europe, in South Africa, and even in Britain. But Saddam Hussein was, for most people, merely the unfamiliar name of a faraway dictator of whom we knew little. And in January, we had no whisper that Iraq would invade Kuwait, and so precipitate the first international crisis since the end of the Cold War. In that first month of the 90s, Britain was otherwise engaged.
I am now in a position to announce that Mr. Nelson Mandela will be released at the Victor Verster prison on Sunday, the 11th of February, at about 3 p.m. The eyes of the world are presently focused on all South Africans. All of us now have an opportunity and the responsibility to prove that we are capable of a peaceful process in creating a new South Africa.
It was 30 years since the first mass uprising against apartheid, a revolt which was bloodily suppressed. In the same year, Nelson Mandela, the revolutionary leader of the African National Congress, was arrested. He was sentenced for life, guilty of treason against apartheid.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people.
The longer Nelson Mandela remained in custody, the more unstable South Africa became, tilting inexorably towards self-destruction. And so far from being forgotten, the very word Mandela had become a worldwide symbol of the black struggle against white tyranny. Thus, after arduous negotiations, Nelson Mandela was finally set free, an elder statesman ready to talk but not to submit.
I have cherished the ideas of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunity. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if need be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
So saying, he set off on a world tour to state his case for the liberation of South Africa. Everywhere he went, he was treated as a hero, as the one man who could negotiate South Africa away from catastrophe. Great concerts were held in his honor, in the exuberant expectation that somehow this single individual had the wisdom and the power to guide his people towards a just tomorrow without bloodshed.
Everywhere we went, we were greeted with the message, keep the pressure on, and apartheid now.
Thus the historic meeting between two radical statesmen, the one ready to demolish the system which had tormented the other, who was himself prepared to explore the future in an atmosphere of mutual respect, free from the threat of violence. The question was whether either had the power to take the people with them.
Both delegations went into these talks with the spirit of letting bygones be bygones.
The overwhelming majority of all the people, whether they black, white, colored or Indian, will welcome this because this is a step towards a peaceful new South Africa.
Good evening. Iraq tells Mrs. Thatcher tonight, you wanted Farzad Bazoft alive. We've sent him back in a box. The Iraqi government, in hanging Mr. Bazoft, was ignoring worldwide pleas for clemency.
This is a very, very grave and serious matter. The Iraqi government's action is an act of barbarism, which is deeply repugnant to all civilized people.
The macabre drama of Bazoft's last days began after he went to Iraq in the hope of filing for the Observer. Once in Baghdad, he apparently stumbled on evidence of an explosion at a missile base south of the city. Making no secret of his destination, and accompanied by a British nurse, Daphne Parish, he reached the base. Thereupon, Saddam Hussein reminded the world that in Iraq, justice and mercy are alien concepts. Bazoft was arrested, charged with spying, and hanged. Yet more evidence that Iraq had become an outlaw state was furnished by the case of the supergun. It had long been assumed that Saddam Hussein was determined to acquire his own nuclear weapons. Here was the best evidence yet. The makings of a long-range weapon suitable for firing nuclear shells, concealed in a lorry bound for Baghdad in violation of the arms embargo against Iraq. A discovery which led to a spot of bother for one of the few innocents involved.
I've just got one thing to say. I'm a hard-working British driver and I just want to go home, and I'm innocent.
Almost the only good news to emerge from Iraq followed the unexpected intervention of President Kaunda, who managed to secure the release of Daphne Parish after 10 months in prison.
It's been a year of highs and lows. It started off very badly. I was in solitary confinement in an Iraqi jail, feeling desperately lonely because no one could speak my language. It got worse when I went to the trial and was given a 15-year sentence. This was followed by the shock of hearing that my friend Farzad Bazoft had been executed. But from then on, it's gone the other way. I was released in July, back to my family and friends, and from then I haven't looked back.
The community charge will be very popular.
In Britain, the year of reckoning began with the poll tax, the product of the Prime Minister's personal conviction.
I have always supported the Conservatives for 38 years, but I will never support them again because they have betrayed us.
No poll tax here!
In the weeks leading up to the introduction of the charge, communities across the land and from all parts of the political spectrum took to the streets in protest.
No poll tax here! No poll tax here! No poll tax!
You get someone who might be like myself, a bricklayer, who's living in a house, a three-bedroom house. How can you justify paying £500 per person there with an income, say, of £15,000, and the same person paying the same amount maybe earning £250,000? There's no justification there at all. That is unfair.
On occasion, peaceful demonstrations were subverted.
I utterly condemn the violent scenes which seem to have been organised by the militant tendency. They are precisely the same kind of violence we've seen before at Grunwick, in the coal strike, and at Wapping, and they're the negation of democracy.
A by-election delivered an unequivocal verdict on the poll tax.
Sylvia Lloyd-Heal is duly elected to represent and serve the aforesaid constituency of Mid Staffordshire in the House of Commons.
And the victor made a prediction.
The dark age of Thatcherism is drawing to a close.
By now, public feeling against the community charge was causing dismay throughout the Conservative Party. A review was promised, but this was not enough to assuage the public mood. A march on Trafalgar Square started amicably enough. There were the usual scuffles, but nothing untoward, until suddenly a breakaway group of demonstrators went on the rampage. The riot lasted for 6 hours. At least 80 civilians and 58 police were injured. 341 people were arrested. Damage caused by looting and arson was estimated at up to £10 million. Resisting any urge to blame the riot on the mass of an electorate still vehemently hostile to the poll tax, the government pressed on with a review which it now described as fundamental.
My announcement today means substantially more relief to those who most need help in the changeover to the community charge. It means a realistic financial settlement for local authorities. I believe we have played our part in helping to smooth the introduction of this major reform. Now it is up to local authorities to play their part.
Thereupon, the government insisted that the review was complete. The matter was closed, which, of course, it wasn't. Indeed, the poll tax remained an open sore, damaging to the government and alarming to those Conservative MPs who saw their marginal seats slipping away at the next election.
This was the year in which the crime rate rose faster than at any time since records were first kept over 130 years ago. Burglary, theft, vandalism, violence against the person, all inexorably up by an average of 12% or a total of over 4 million offences. As always, there were explanations: the state of the economy, some social malaise or moral failure, and there were consequences.
BBC News at midnight. There have been dozens of casualties in rioting at Strangeways Prison in Manchester. They include prisoners, prison officers, and police sent in to restore order. There's widespread damage from fire. Several hundred inmates have surrendered to be taken to other prisons. The trouble is continuing tonight among the 700 who remain.
An explosion in one or other of Britain's overcrowded jails had long been predicted.
If people are going to treat men like animals, then obviously the natural reaction would be that they're going to act like them. It builds up and it builds up, and then eventually it has to come out and it has to explode somewhere. But if you're saying to me, was it justifiable that they had to demonstrate in this way, I would certainly say yes.
The fury of the inmates was matched by the frustration of the authorities, who were instructed to wear down the resistance by waiting. It took 25 days.
We'd like to see a clear requirement that a prisoner is entitled to a single cell with integral sanitation, clear entitlement about visits, letters, the activities that he or she is allowed to take part in, including religious activities, medical care, visits, and I'd be very interested to see whether we couldn't develop a minimum standard about distance from home.
After the riots, the ruined prison was evacuated. The promise of new legislation to keep petty crooks out of jail acquired a new edge of urgency. But the government was at pains to make clear that it had by no means gone soft.
We've all had enough. So I've decided to ask Parliament to create a new offence of prison mutiny, which will carry a maximum penalty of 10 years on top of the sentence actually being served.
The party conference liked the tough talk, but the authorities were well aware that the prison crisis had yet to be solved.
For me, 1990 was a unique, an amazing, demanding year. It started on the 1st of April with those events that I later described as an explosion of evil, and that's a description that I stand by. Later on, before the end of the incident, I was already thinking of the rebuilding of the prison, because that was crucial for the future of Strangeways. We got that decision in May, and from the new buildings, I know will arise a much more positive regime, and it is that that makes me certain that the prison service faces the future with confidence.
In a year when the environment was yet again the subject of sharp debate, the Prince of Wales went on television to deliver a personal report on the state of the planet, in which he shared his private feelings with a much wider public.
Do we not, most of us, feel a profound, almost unconscious unease at the course we've all been taking? Almost as if we were living on borrowed time, desperately rushing, exploiting, doing, expecting others to come after us to clear up the mess, as if after a wild adolescent party which has gone terribly wrong.
As if on cue, the main political parties in Britain queued up to unveil their rival documents, alternative blueprints to save the environment.
We want a cleaner Britain. We want a greener Britain. We want a cleaner, a greener, and a safer world.
If you want a government for the environment, go for the roads.
Trust us. We will look after your environment. Others are failing to do so.
Tomorrow's rain washes stains away. Something in our minds will always stay.
There was a host of international conferences as world leaders gathered in one grand venue after another to display their green convictions on the ozone layer, the Antarctic, the rainforests, and the greenhouse effect.
It's a most important event for all our countries, and I wish you success in your endeavors.
The physical quality of the Earth, which we pass on to future generations.
At all these conferences, there was fine rhetoric from many leaders in many tongues, much agreement about the problem, but no great march towards a global solution.
أرضه خالية من الثروات الطبيعية بترولية ومعدنية فهو يخضع.
When it comes to saving the global environment, we are all in this together.
We must take action, even if it involves considerable costs.
Environmental policies that ignore the economic factor, the human factor, are destined to fail.
In sharp counterpoint to all that was said about the environment, there was more graphic evidence of the destruction wrought by our contamination of the natural world. In this reckoning, it's still the polluted, not the polluter, who pays.
Can I go through that one? Is it possible?
Can you turn one, one quick?
The reckoning in the Soviet Union began with the worsening crisis of a palpably crumbling empire. In an effort to cajole Lithuania away from secession, President Gorbachev went walkabout through a hostile people. Gorbachev's efforts were in vain. Despite vague threats and crass propaganda, the people of Lithuania ignored the voice of Moscow. At the ballot box, they voted overwhelmingly for independence from the Soviet Union.
80% of popular vote for Sąjūdis is a very clear indication what people of Lithuania think.
BBC News at midnight. Lithuania's parliament has voted for independence after 50 years of Soviet rule. The White House has called on Moscow to respect the Lithuanian decision.
There were fears that the conflict might escalate into an international crisis along the old Cold War divide, but Washington was notably cautious.
Any attempt to coerce or intimidate or forcibly intervene against the Lithuanian people is bound to backfire. That is inevitable. The Soviet leadership has said again and again that it will not use force, and we welcome that.
BBC News at 6 o'clock. The Soviet Union has now turned off most of the gas which is piped into Lithuania, as well as all of the oil, and the Kremlin has said that more economic sanctions may be imposed.
Squeezed by sanctions, Lithuania was dragged to the Kremlin for an interminable round of negotiations. The talks soon embraced every other republic, as Gorbachev tried every constitutional ploy to arrest the drift towards the disintegration of the Soviet state. In the spirit of perestroika, May Day in Moscow was not so much a military parade as a popular march past. That at least was the intention. But the authorities failed to reckon with the new mood of the Russian people. Open defiance on what was once the most solemn day in the Soviet calendar.
The official parade was one of the shortest and least convincing ever, but this is the sting in the tail. Unofficial groups making an unprecedented protest under the very nose of the Kremlin leadership.
By now, an old rival of the Soviet leader was once more in the ascendant. The new president of the Russian Federation promising that he too would liberate his people from the Kremlin's diktat.
За каждого человека России, за то, чтобы от кризиса она перешла к нормальному своему состоянию, чтобы Россия действительно звучала и жила так, как она жила раньше. За обновленную Россию. Спасибо.
Gorbachev, whose own survival was yet again in question, used a BBC interview to insist that he would stay to fight for the most important cause in his life.
Для меня перестройка – это мой выбор. С этим связана моя судьба как человека, как политика. Я с этой дороги не сойду, какие бы давления на меня не оказывались. То, что я располагаю, я употреблю для того, чтобы этот процесс двигался. И прежде всего я вижу свою задачу, чтобы все перестроечные силы самых разных оттенков, все демократические силы этого общества объединять для того, чтобы содействовать успеху перестройки. Вот моя позиция. Это твердая позиция и навсегда.
The defiance of the Baltics, Georgia, Moldavia, Armenia, and Great Mother Russia herself was exacerbated by the collapse of an arthritic economy. The harvest was left to rot, while basic foodstuffs stayed put at the wrong end of a corrupt and incompetent supply line. The shelves became bare, and the population began to fear famine before the winter was out. The Kremlin was obliged to seek help from outside, an appeal to Europe to send in basic supplies to save the Soviet people from the risk of starvation. The humiliation of begging from abroad sharpened popular resentment and reinforced the diehards whose resistance to perestroika had helped accomplish this calamity. And then, in the cruelest reckoning of all, Gorbachev's most powerful and trusted ally strode to the podium at the People's Congress and stunned the world by announcing that he would resign as foreign minister. Warning that the Soviet Union was threatened by a new dictatorship, he declared, "I cannot reconcile myself to what is happening in our country and the trials awaiting our people." Suddenly, the titanic scale of the conflict between reformers and hardliners in the Kremlin was laid bare before the world. The future of the Soviet Union perilously uncertain.
Empty terraces filled with silent echoes of midsummer frenzy when this stadium became the center of the universe for tens of thousands of pilgrims who came here to Rome to celebrate a grand passion shared by millions of people all over the world, and not least, of course, in Scotland, Ireland, and in England. To those who stayed behind, that crusade proved two things. You don't need to be a hooligan to be a fan, and a glorious operatic aria can make it to the top of the charts.
Just forward of the penalty spot. McPherson got a flick. McCall! McCall has scored for Scotland!
Alan a shot. Good save by Leighton. Correct is it on the rebound. And Wallace following it in. And it's a goal for Brazil.
Now we're going to see Timofte, the second substitute for Romania. Barely a runner. Oh, and it's been saved! Jack Charlton doesn't know whether to smile or not. Ireland are in the last 8 and the party can begin.
Miller makes it look so easy, a kick in! And Cameroon lead. Right, Lineker, penalty. It's all square. And here's Lineker! And he's brought down. In comes Lineker and scores! England lead by 3-2.
Now Stuart Pearce. Can he do it for England? He can't. Ildner has made a save. Olaf Thon. They lead 4-3, and that means that England have to score the next one to stay in it. Would you want to be Chris Waddle now, or even Stuart Pearce? And England are out of the World Cup. It's number 15, Pedro Monzon, the substitute, who has dived in on Klinsmann. Monzon is off. Red card in the World Cup final, the first time it's ever happened. Fuller is brought down, penalty! And is that the goal that wins the World Cup?
Well, after 8 years as the England manager, World Cup Italia 90 was for me a marvellous, wonderful experience. And the team played very good football. You could say, in fact, that in the match against West Germany, it was the best football the country has seen from an England team since 1966, over 24 years. Two things emerged. The team won the Fair Play Award in a very tough, prestigious and competitive tournament. And that was a hard thing to do. And secondly, because of the manner we played, we restored our pride, our reputation and credibility back in world football.
Why not? Why not indeed? We're all friends now, eh?
A prawn cocktail.
All in the market together. Old differences forgotten, and no need at all to mention the war. Sorry.
Well, we were all friends together until a leading member of the cabinet did his Fawlty Towers routine too. When Nicholas Ridley gave vent to some earthily outspoken views about Europe, he exposed a raw nerve in the Tory party.
Will the Prime Minister not recognise that what the Right Honourable Gentleman has said is not just deeply offensive to our allies and partners, but deeply damaging to our country's interests, and he must go?
My right honourable friend has expressed his very great regret and unreservedly withdrawn his remarks. They do not represent the government's view or indeed my own.
But Nicholas Ridley could not be saved without further straining relations with Europe. He resigned. The government had other pressing troubles. Opinion polls showed the Tories well behind Labour, and there was a simple explanation: the state of the economy.
We cannot afford to relax policy, notwithstanding the prospect of lower growth. The buoyancy of past demand means that inflation has been far more stubborn than anyone expected. A significant fall is still some months away, and a number of factors will mean that the position will worsen noticeably before it improves. This will be reflected in the retail price index during the next few months.
BBC News at 6 o'clock.
There's been a sharp rise in the annual rate of inflation to 9.4%, the highest for 8 years. The Chancellor says it's still too early to say whether the interest rate policy... Inflation has risen again. It's up to 9.7%. There were large rises in some food and
Inflation
food
is in double figures for the first time since 1982.
High interest rates to combat inflation tipped the economy inexorably towards the edge of recession, with familiar consequences.
The downward trend in unemployment has ended after nearly 4 years. The number of people out of work rose by about 1,200 to just over 1,600,000.
And then came the big news.
Good evening. The headlines at 6 o'clock. Britain is to join the European exchange rate mechanism on Monday, and interest rates will be cut by 1%.
No one should think for a moment that this will be an easy option or a soft one. It is not a quick fix.
Despite the Chancellor's warning, there was some euphoria, not least within a government which was greatly relieved that an issue which had for so long tortured the cabinet was finally settled. If Margaret Thatcher had at last yielded to this European imperative, perhaps she would be more amenable to others. Perhaps.
One morning this summer, the calm of a Sussex village was shattered when a gang of terrorists chose as their next defenseless target the man whose home this was. They chose him not because he carried a weapon, not because he served in the armed forces, not because he held high office against them. He was selected because he was an elected representative of the people, because he happened to be a close friend of Margaret Thatcher, and because he spoke his mind about the IRA with clarity, conviction, and courage.
There is one message that should go out. First, of sympathy to the families of those who have been murdered. And secondly, a message to the IRA that they will never, never win. We are never going to surrender to men who can carry out this type of murder. Their campaign is totally futile, is causing great misery, and it will never, never win.
1 week after saying those words, Ian Gow was blown up by a car bomb outside his home as the IRA renewed a murderous offensive on the British mainland. one more victim in a long and apparently endless list. In escalating their campaign, the bombers did not flinch from selecting soft targets. It was enough that they could be loosely identified with what the IRA called the British establishment.
This is yet another example of a diversity of attack that can be mounted by this organisation. I only repeat what I've said on previous occasions. If you want to live, you must look and keep on looking.
It was perhaps remarkable that the explosion of 12 Semtex bombs did not murder more than 2 people or injure more than 36. The government ordered a review of security, but in the person of the Secretary of State, it also maintained the political offensive, evidently determined against the odds to make some progress towards peace. There was little room for manoeuvre, although the search for greater cooperation with the Republic on border security did yield some benefit, and the enduring conflict over extradition was not entirely deadlocked. But in a year which marked the 5th anniversary of the Anglo-Irish Agreement, high hopes about an end to the conflict were notably absent. And as usual, the relentless operation against the IRA seemed so routine as to be almost ignored, except, of course, within the province itself. But 1990 was marked by a fresh political initiative. In the hope of isolating the IRA, the purpose was to persuade the political leaders of the nationalist community to negotiate with their counterparts on the unionist side to devise a new framework for the government of Northern Ireland. The talks almost started, but not quite.
I had hoped to be in a position by now to give some indication of when it might be possible to move to formal talks. I am in fact not yet in a position to do so. I have said that talks are possible rather than probable.
Then came this, the most hideous of IRA atrocities, when a civilian was strapped into a van loaded with explosives and ordered to drive to an army checkpoint in Londonderry. 5 soldiers were killed in the blast, and the driver, Patsy Gillespie, also died.
I'm so angry. This is the second time they've done this to me. I'm just getting over the first time. What happened then? They came into the house before. They loaded my car with 200 pounds of explosives. And they made my husband drive it to Fort George. But at least that time he came home.
This year, someone paid £50 million for a Van Gogh. The Monet exhibition played to capacity crowds. Glasgow was the European city of culture. The 3 graces were saved for the nation. And the arts were graced by 3 ministers, one of whom managed to secure the biggest increase in government subsidy for a decade. It was not, however, enough to stop the Royal Shakespeare Company deciding that for 4 months it would have to close its 2 theatres here in the Barbican, thus replacing one familiar slogan, "The show must go on," with another, "The theatre is dark."
Which was of little concern to the devotees of a new and unfathomable fashion.
Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles! Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles!
We'll stop and look at each other sometime and go, oh my, you know, what did we do? What did we create? You know, the beast.
The Turtles had originally starred in an almost adult strip cartoon, but with television exposure and mass marketing, they soon became a childhood obsession.
These turtle boys don't cut 'em no slack. Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles!
call Raph.
The turtles were really good with them when they were fighting.
Yeah,
Raphael is cool, but they're different, aren't they? Because it's like sort of animals being able to save the world and that sort of thing, rather than humans, and it's not sort of really violent, is it?
They're not called Ninja Turtles, they're called Heroes.
Yeah, that's silly, isn't it? They should be Ninja Turtles, really. I mean, they are Ninja Turtles, isn't they? I mean, they're heroes as well. Maybe they should call them Hero Ninja Turtles.
Hero Turtles, heroes in a half shell. Turtle power!
At the beginning of August, while most of the world's leaders prepared for a summer vacation, Saddam Hussein sent his troops marching to the south.
The news headlines this morning: Iraq has launched an invasion of Kuwait. It says the Kuwaiti government has fallen.
The invasion follows the breakdown of talks between the two countries over oil production and territory.
Iraqi troops are in the city itself. They've surrounded or occupied all key installations, ministries, the Emir's palace. We've heard that the United States Embassy in Kuwait City itself has been occupied.
We call for the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of all the Iraqi forces. There is no place for this sort of naked aggression in today's world.
You cannot have a situation where one country marches in and takes over another country which is a member of the United Nations.
We have appealed to all our friends around the world, including the United States, to come to our aid and assistance. Let me say that we would like to have military assistance in order to survive.
We reject any foreign interference in the current events.
Within the past few minutes, the UN Security Council in emergency session has passed a virtually unanimous resolution to impose sanctions on Iraq.
Iraq must learn that its disregard for international law will have crippling political and economic costs.
And if diplomacy and sanctions do fail, Mr. Bush will use force. More US warships have left their home ports today and are heading for the Middle East. And the word from him tonight is that he is determined, whatever the cost, to force Iraq to back off.
America had begun a commitment to the Gulf, which would involve the dispatch of the most powerful armada of all time. The first of nearly 500,000 US troops arrived in the Saudi desert to protect the kingdom against the threat from Iraq. Inside Iraq, Saddam Hussein showed himself adept at whipping up national fervor.
We call you for the holy war. Do not hesitate to do so. You should stand up against foreign troops.
The new orders to the American fleet are specific. They are to stop, search and turn away any ships carrying cargo bound for Iraq or Kuwait. The commanders are authorized to use minimum force necessary to ensure that those orders are carried out.
Baghdad's food queues have grown longer in the past 48 hours. Reports from the poorer quarters speak of early hardship. The authorities have decreed severe punishments against hoarders and profiteers.
A never-ending torrent of traffic pours down the road from Baghdad. The flow is now so great that the figures are less precise. Thousands and thousands trying to head home via Jordan.
It's a vexed question as to how the authorities can keep this border closed when there are tens of thousands waiting to come across. Everyone here speaks of their friends and colleagues waiting to follow them. Quite simply, they're frightened of a war.
Iraq's taking of hostages now has a new dimension. Britons being rounded up from their homes, apparently at gunpoint.
The Foreign Secretary, Mr. Douglas Hurd, has warned that the roundup of foreigners in Iraq and Kuwait could go on for some time. The Foreign Office has announced that a further 82 Britons have been detained by Iraqi troops in Kuwait City.
The Iraqis, by their own profession, are moving our citizens around, moving other Western citizens around, and are using them as a shield.
I would like to say to my family, my wife, Heidi, my children, Alexandra, Christopher, Philip, that I love them very much. I miss them. I hope they have the strength, the patience, and the courage to live through this crisis.
We'd just like to give a message to all our family and our friends who must be worrying about us. We want to say that we're together, that we're well, and that the children are being amazingly strong and brave in a difficult situation.
There was good news as well, a birthday celebrated in uniquely British style, by turns eccentric and touching. Commentator David Dimbleby.
A life which spans the century. And this evening, all the organizations that she's helped over those years as patron or president or colonel-in-chief have come here to speak for the whole nation in celebrating this, her 90th year.
To you all, and not least to those who organized this tribute, I offer my warmest gratitude for making this such a marvelous birthday occasion.
There are some things that you might rather forget, but no review can easily ignore. And here's one of them. It involves this cemetery in Nottingham, which since the autumn has been the focus of macabre and horrifying allegations. The more terrible because they now seem almost routine. The allegations concern the sexual abuse and ritual torture of young children. In a year when the atrocities committed by the depraved upon the innocent reached almost unimaginable depths, here is a glancing reminder of what may have happened not only in this place, but elsewhere as well.
According to testimony from young children and their foster parents, this cemetery was used for satanic rituals in which the children were cruelly abused. The allegations are unproven and are still the subject of bitter dispute between social workers and the police. Similar allegations in other parts of the country produced similar disputes, while child abuse of all kinds was seldom out of the headlines.
Good evening. The Home Secretary says he's absolutely horrified by reports that several young boys may have been killed during the filming of pornographic videos.
The charity Child Watch has recorded a big increase in the number of children suffering at the hands of paedophile sex rings. It says the number of cases where more than one adult is concerned in sexual abuse has trebled since last year.
Police are investigating more attempts by people posing as social workers to examine young children in their homes. In Devon, the man was turned away by parents after failing to show any identification. And in Sheffield, a couple were refused access to a 4-year-old boy when they called at his home. There have now been more than 20 similar incidents reported in areas as far apart as West Yorkshire and Somerset.
By way of relief, Simon Jones, abducted from near his home but found 2 months later only half a mile away.
This is the happiest day of my life. I've got my son back. I'm absolutely over the moon to have him here with me.
And Alexandra Griffiths, who had been kidnapped from a maternity ward in St Thomas's Hospital, was found after 17 days quite unhurt. Her mother, who had appealed on television for the return of her daughter, was overwhelmed.
my name.
How are you feeling?
Please, coming
I could describe it in words.
There was times when I was feeling very, very down, and I thought she's not going to come back. Then there was other times where I'd be, she's coming back today, she's coming back today, but the evening would come and there was no Alex. And then came that magic day, 17 days later, the phone call that they'd found Alexandra. I was absolutely over the moon, and I couldn't put it into words exactly how I felt. It did take me 3 days, actually, to realise that she was back. But it's the best time of my life, and here she is now.
In South Africa, the reckoning was only too evident. The prospects for a peaceful evolution from apartheid to democracy were jeopardized by an upsurge of violence, not between black and white, but of black against black.
My message to those of you involved in this battle of brother against brother is this. Take your guns, your knives, and your pangas, and throw them into the sea.
phesheya kolwandle lakushoni
4,000 lives in 4 years. That was the death toll up to August of this year. Then in 1 month, another 800 people died. The killing was to continue sporadically for the rest of the year. And while Nelson Mandela and President de Klerk reaffirmed their commitment to the peace process, the atmosphere is once again soured with suspicion. On the 15th of September, a moment of pride and nostalgia as the Royal Air Force remembered those men in their flying machines who had saved Britain in her darkest hour 50 years ago.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
We managed to get over 400 of our old gentlemen back from all over the world, and they enjoyed it enormously, and it was a very, very worthwhile occasion. The flypast itself, which was organized, of course, by the Ministry of Defense, and very well organized, was a very evocative occasion, particularly the lead flight, which was Hurricanes and Spitfires. And we marched past, which made us very proud, and we were even prouder when we knew that we had a contingent of our ground crew, who were not always remembered, actually marching past with us. It was a most wonderful celebration of a very important occasion.
A dreary afternoon, the gloomy scaffolding of a building site. Not much, you might think, to inspire you here. And yet, this place is perhaps the grandest symbol of the greatest upheaval of this half of the 20th century. Just over a year ago, this was no man's land. Running along behind me there was a wall. If you tried to cross it, at least from east to west, you'd be shot. Now the wall's gone, and they are rebuilding this monument, the Brandenburg Gate, in celebration of a city that is no longer divided, in a nation which in October 1990 was once more united.
The unification of Germany, which very few had expected to witness, was accomplished with a speed and determination that was utterly bewildering to those who had been schooled in the traditional diplomacy of the Cold War.
I'm happy about reunification. I think it's a good chance for the greater Germany or for the Germany in future.
I think everyone is very enthusiastic and very glad about the reunification of Germany.
The creation of a single German state was a triumph for Helmut Kohl, the most powerful man in Europe, the undisputed leader of a nation which now bestrode the continent as a future colossus. The German election served only to confirm a foregone conclusion. The Chancellor would win by a walkover. This was not the only great election of the year. There were others no less remarkable, especially when you remember that a little over a year ago, Eastern Europe was still blanketed by communism. As it was, there were free elections from north to south, along the other side of what had once been the Iron Curtain. Cause for cautious rejoicing, except perhaps in one or two states where the outcome confirmed that democracy was still a very fragile notion. Only Albania had remained untouched. And even here, in an unprecedented act of defiance, the opposition finally took to the streets to call for an end to Stalinism. The regime suppressed the revolt, but also made tentative moves to legalize political parties. By December, it seemed not entirely fanciful to suppose that Albania also might soon be free. For the first time in 50 years of European history, the advancing tanks were actually on the retreat. A weapons treaty was signed and another was in the offing, while the accelerating departure of Soviet forces from what used to be the front line between East and West seemed to state unequivocally that the Cold War was indeed over. And in the heart of the new Germany, the two big men of Europe chose a self-consciously casual setting, symbolically to bury the past and to assure one another and the rest of the world that a new age was indeed upon us. But in Eastern Europe, the reckoning was severe. In Romania, of course, where the evil of Ceausescu was thoroughly and horrifyingly exposed to the world. And in every emerging democracy, there was an emerging crisis. Ramshackle industrial plants incapable of competing on the open market. A level of pollution that not only inflicted fearful damage on the environment, but also cut short the life expectancy of entire cities. Economic crisis fueled social and ethnic unrest. In Germany, the police have battled with gangs of neo-Nazis, and more widely in the new Europe, there was a surge in anti-Semitism, while competing nationalisms lurked disconcertingly in the background. So after the heady celebrations of German unity, there was something of a hangover in Europe, an uncertainty about the future, touched by anxieties in the West about the fragility of the East, sucked so suddenly into the new world.
Leicester think it's gonna do it. Leicester has won.
Yo, I told you, you can't touch this. Why you standing there, man? You can't touch this. Yo, sound the bell. School is in, sucker. You can't touch this. Give me a song or rhythm, making them sweat. That's what I'm giving them now. They know. You talk about the hammer, you're talking about a show that's hyped and tight. Singers are sweating so fast, them a whiteboard tape. To learn what's it gonna take in the 90s to run the charts. Legit. Either work hard or you might as well quit. That's word because you know you can't touch this. You can't touch this.
It's a magnificent English try. Nicely out to Gavin Hastings. Gavin Hastings who's going to get through. On goes Stanger. Stanger could be there, but it's a try.
Stop. Hammer time. Go with the flow. It is said if you can't prove the list, then you probably are dead. So wave your hands in the air. Bust a few moves. Run your fingers through your hair. This is it. For a winner, dance to this, and you're gonna get there. The move. Slide your rump. Just for a minute, let's all do the bump. Bump, bump, bump. Yeah. You can't touch this. Look, man. You can't touch this. You better get hype, boy, because you know you can't touch this. Ring the bell. School's back in. Break it down.
The conflict of loyalty to my right honourable friend the Prime Minister, and after more than 2 decades together, that instinct of loyalty is still very real, and of loyalty to what I perceive to be the true interest of this nation, that conflict of loyalty has become all too great. I no longer believe it possible to resolve that conflict from within this government. That is why I have resigned. In doing so, I've done what I believe to be right for my party and my country. The time has come for others to consider their own response to the tragic conflict of loyalties with which I have myself wrestled for perhaps too long.
I am persuaded that I now have a better prospect than Mrs. Thatcher of leading the Conservatives to a 4th electoral victory.
Newsflash from the LBC newsroom.
We have just heard that Margaret Thatcher has failed to beat off Michael Heseltine's challenge to her leadership.
I think that's a sensational result. I think Mrs. Thatcher's future is now in the gravest doubt.
It's here, this is the microphone.
Naturally very pleased that I got more than half the parliamentary party and disappointed that it's not quite enough to win on the first ballot. So I confirm it is my intention to let my name go forward for the second ballot.
I will therefore allow my name to go forward into the second round.
The general view in Westminster is that it's running very strongly against her, and many people think that by this evening we will have some kind of announcement.
It's just been announced from Downing Street that Mrs. Thatcher is to resign as Prime Minister.
That I can unite the party in handling present problems and in winning the next general election.
I believe I would like the opportunity of trying to unite the party. A lot of colleagues have suggested to me that I may be able to do so.
The result is still quite unpredictable. John Major is undoubtedly on the surface the front runner.
Michael Heseltine, 131. Douglas Hurd, 56. John Major, 185.
John Major's our next Prime Minister, there's no doubt about that. I will be a bit surprised if the other candidates before the night is out have not conceded this election.
I shall vote for John Major, and I urge all those people who supported me to do the same.
I shall vote for him on the third ballot.
John Major will go to Buckingham Palace at 10:30 tomorrow morning and return to Downing Street as the youngest Prime Minister this century.
There's no ill feeling at the end of this contest. At the end of this week for the leadership of the Conservative Party, at the end of this week, I believe that there is a smile on the face of the party that will mean we're fully united for the future.
Whatever the reckoning, the ditching of Margaret Thatcher, precipitated by Europe, goaded by the poll tax, was essentially intuitive. The conqueror of the 80s was not right for the 90s.
We do need to continue to build upon what has been done in the last 11 years to make this an open society of opportunity. That my government proposes to do.
She had been garlanded by her party and then stabbed through the heart. But as ever, Margaret Thatcher seemed untouched. Now on the back benches, she was already an echo.
Our party is the party of equality of opportunity.
We should back the workers and not the shirkers.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is the ladies, not for turning. Just rejoice at that news. Not always standing there as moaning ninnies. Now stop it.
Gain all you can, save all you can, give all you can.
I hope to go on and on.
When good has to be upheld, when evil has to be overcome, then Britain will take up arms.
It's 8 o'clock on Friday the 30th of November. The headlines this morning: the Security Council has authorized military action against Iraq if its troops don't get out of Kuwait by January the 15th.
The switch from the defensive to the offensive was designed to increase the pressure on Iraq. It reflected a frustration with the slow squeeze of sanctions, and it was made possible because the UN forces were now so powerful as to make the threat of military action increasingly persuasive.
President Bush has given his strongest warning yet that force may be needed to drive Iraq out of Kuwait. In a series of speeches to American and British troops in Saudi Arabia, he described Saddam Hussein as a classic bully kicking sand in the face of the world.
But inside America, there was growing dissent.
To Fred Brooks, my only son, may God bring you back safe.
By the autumn, the opinion polls were turning against the president.
And we just don't know what we're fighting for. Why are they sending all those people over there?
That popular opposition was reflected in the US Senate, where senior figures from previous administrations were summoned to the Armed Services Committee.
I think that we can avoid war and still achieve the objective of Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait.
Sensitive to the critics, and also perhaps to the dangers of war, the president offered talks.
To go the extra mile for peace, I will issue an invitation to Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz to come to Washington.
Meanwhile, with characteristic cunning, Saddam Hussein had allowed some of the hostages to go free, enough to keep him in the headlines, not enough to dent his human shield. Elder statesmen played their part too.
I explained to him that
these were particular groups of people whom I felt ought to return to their homes, and that retaining them in Iraq created ill feeling in Britain.
When it touches down at Heathrow, I'll believe it's all happened.
Come closer, sir. Magic! It's magic! I've got my wife!
BBC News at 6 o'clock. President Saddam Hussein has ordered the immediate release of all the hostages in Iraq. The hostages and their families hope they'll be reunited for Christmas.
Please.
Saddam Hussein presumably hoped that letting the hostages out would weaken the resolve of the coalition against him.
Bloody brilliant!
Over the moon.
It's the end of a nightmare.
We've talked to a lot of Kuwaitis, and they've taken knives out of Kuwaitis. They've electrocuted people in the testicles. They've shot them.
The conditions were desperate at times. Very little food. The food we got was stolen by the guards. It was an episode I want to forget rapidly.
The evidence of those who emerged from hiding in Kuwait testified in detail to the unspeakable atrocities committed by the Iraqi occupiers. The Americans reiterated that Saddam Hussein would have to leave Kuwait by January the 15th or be driven out. And he declared that Iraq would never leave its new province, and that since Allah was on his side, victory would be his.
We've offered 15 days between...
As the rhetoric toughened and the slide towards war appeared to accelerate, that last mile of talks got lost in mutual recrimination and an interminable wrangle over dates.
From me, Saddam Hussein will know it.
Thus, as the year came to an end, the men of the Queen's Royal Irish Hussars, one small fraction of a massive force, waited for action which now seemed imminent. If it happened, the conflict would be of unpredictable outcome. Many thousands of young men might die, and the Middle East would be convulsed by an incalculable upheaval. Yet it was the prevailing wisdom that unless Saddam Hussein yielded to the will of the United Nations, war was inevitable.
Whatever the final reckoning, whether history comes to judge Operation Desert Shield as the battering ram of a new world order, or as little more than a military spasm in the quicksands of the Middle East, it is tempting to conclude from the vantage point of December 1990 that here, as elsewhere in the world, all has changed, and changed utterly.